Hello and welcome to Off My Shelves, and in this episode we're going to be looking at Best of Enemies, a history of the US and Middle Eastern relations, parts 1, 2 and 3 by David B and Jean-Pierre Filiu. And so we will get underway. Apologies if I pronounced any names badly then, I have no doubt I probably did. But yeah, these three books are published by Self-Made Hero, which is a fantastic publisher. If you haven't looked at their back catalogue and their books, definitely get on it, because they do loads of very interesting books. And this intrigued me right from the get-go, because it's essentially a historical book looking at the various points that the United States have met with the Middle East. But either way, before I get to that, looking at the build of the book, so all the builds are uniform, except weirdly for part 3, because the colour of part 3 is slightly darker. Don't know why that is, and it's annoying on the shelf, but not too bad, because I haven't got that bad an OCD with my shelves that it, puts me off. But either way, they are sewn binding, and really good quality sewn binding for the size of their books, because they are a little bit smaller than your standard size trade paperback. Black Beetle being standard size really, and yeah, same width but a little bit smaller, so they're a little bit bigger than your manga and all that type of thing. But either way, they're not oversized or anything like that. They're all matte paper inside, and they're all black and white, and the artwork by David B is phenomenal and was one of the main draws. David B created one of my favourite non-fiction autobiographical books called Epileptic, and after experiencing his artwork on that, I sought out what other artwork he did, and I came across these books. And as I said in the start, the books are looking at the relationships between the United States and all various Middle Eastern states and countries, and it very much kind of has a lot to go through. There's a lot of history to cram into these three books, and particularly when you're only looking at about 110 or so pages per book, they certainly are an accurate historical read, because Jean-Pierre Filiu is an academic and he approaches this like a history book. So it hasn't got references or a bibliography in it per se, but what it has got in it is it's got accurate historical information, and it very much is narration heavy. There's very little dialogue, but the narration is all that historical background, and then David B's art is just visualizing what the history is talking about on that particular page. But David B's art is so out there and so interesting that every one of these panels is like a little bit of abstract art really, because he doesn't do anything straightforward. He really does kind of delve deep into all of these little panels, and sometimes the panel can be literally the size of a matchbox, but there's so much going on that it kind of blows your mind. And his artwork is very much kind of going to be polarizing. I think there's going to be some people that love it and some people that hate it, because he certainly combines what he enjoys most about art with this historical narrative. So some of the pages are really out there, and like I say, some of them have got stuff going on all over the place and can be hard to follow in some way, I think. But either way, they're always intriguing and interesting beyond any shadow of a doubt, I think. The book opens up retelling the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh and telling that story, but also then bringing comparisons between that and Abu Ghraib and all that type of thing, and it sets the stage essentially for them going back in time fully and exploring when the United States and the Middle Eastern countries first clashed. And obviously that is going back to 1783, and so this book is charting between 1783 and 1953, so a heck of a chunk of time. The chunkiest book is the first book, but equally I think it's the easiest to understand as well, because the complexity of the political relationships is far more straightforward and simplistic, because you're looking at piracy happening between the two nations and the United States trying to stop that piracy happening across the Mediterranean and other countries, and loads of deals going on with different nations, and really it's the formation of a relationship between these two areas of the world, this new North America and this very ancient culture that exists across the Middle East in Iran and Iraq and all that type of thing. So it's very much those two coming together, but equally backstabbing each other all over the place. The latter half of the book leads you into very much the kind of main focus which everyone would instantly think, oh yeah, that's what this book is going to be about. And that's the oil trade of the Middle East, and how that started back in the 1860s, but then how that followed on then when the dependency of oil came in massively, and how Churchill and all of the other nations, because essentially America is very much, you know, a bit player, you know, it's involved heavily in these things with the Middle East, but certainly France and Russia and England in particular and Britain are heavily involved in the Middle East and making the biggest changes of these countries really, and their oil supply and all that. But then when the United States steps in later on down the line to kind of almost subvert what England and Britain are doing, that's when they get heavily involved, and that's when things start to get very much more complex. And so the latter half of this book really delves in deep to the oil trade and the presidency of Iran, and how Roosevelt and other people are essentially trying to subvert the country and make the country do what they want to do rather than the country doing what it wants to do. And obviously the book shows quite outright and quite bare bones and unsympathetic just the historical facts. So it leaves it up to you which side you want to kind of show sympathy for, if any, or what your conclusions are. But volume 2 or part 2 looks at 53 to 84. So it takes in the Reagan administration and its relationship with Iran, but in particular this looks at a lot of the Egyptian wars going on at the time, and the president of Egypt, Nasser I believe, and he is trying to be dominant in that Middle Eastern area really. And obviously this really delves massively into the Israeli relationship and how Israel fits into this picture, and the relationship with America and Israel really influencing everything that goes on here massively. But what I will say is, even though the time scale is very much shortened in these are far more dense with those kind of characters and those bits of history that if you're unfamiliar with, it doesn't give you all the answers, certainly doesn't, and you will be, if you're interested, googling and looking online for certain battles and certain incidents after the book to kind of flesh out your knowledge of what you have been presented with. But ultimately it does give you enough to go on, but then it does keep it as interesting as it can to read without getting bogged down explaining everything about this one character or about this one conflict. It moves on because it hasn't got a lot of time to tell a really in-depth detailed story. And the final volume is 84 to 2013, and obviously as you can see from the front cover with Barack Obama and Osama bin Laden on, this is when we get very much into the modern day relationship between the United States and the Middle Eastern countries. It starts off really deeply and seriously looking at the Gulf War and Saddam Hussein and his invasion of Kuwait, and how America was involved in various parts of these conflicts as a peacekeeper and everything really. It does bring in Afghanistan and the training of the Taliban and all this type of thing. And then obviously it brings in September the 11th and what happened there and the aftermath of that. And it really does give a very unflinching, emotionless look at all this period. And I know I said that just now, but it's very important because I think this is very much a history book disguised as a series of graphic novels, because it doesn't give you much in the way of character development, it doesn't give you much in the way of a protagonist or an antagonist. It just gives you historical facts and lets you decide where you sit and where you want to look more into and that type of thing. But David B's art throughout is definitely the biggest draw for me, because obviously the history, you can get it in a load of different forms. You can pick up probably a history book that may be more detailed than this, but then combining that history and that narrative with David B's art is really what makes these books sing for me anyway, because like I say, every little panel is like this really amazing piece of artistry, because he goes all out to do some amazingly crazy and inventive panels in these books, and yeah, they're fabulous I think. But that is a look at Best of Enemies, a history of US and Middle Eastern relations, parts 1 to 3, and thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.